Welcome. So we're going to go ahead and go through the last part of the family chapter online today in the next four modules. And so we're going to, if you recall, we stepped off with talking about family relations and then delving a little more into siblings. And now we're going to look at what happens when family relations don't go so well and parents get divorced. So divorce is obviously something that's very common in our society. Well over half of marriages end in divorce, and most of the time those divorces involve children. And so you can see here the changing divorce rates as we see over time. And you can tell all the way up until maybe about the 1920s or so, pretty low rate of divorce, only about 2% in the entire population in a given year. But as you can see, there's a real spike starting out in around the 1940s, late 1940s. A lot of that a result, of course, of the end of World War II, because a lot of people got married right before the soldiers went off to war. And when they returned back from the war, they were fortunate enough to discover they didn't like each other so much when they had to be around each other all the time. So you saw a real big kick up there. But as you can see, through the 50s, 60s, and even into the beginning 70s, you have a pretty low rate, but then it kicks up to almost double, starting in the mid-70s, going all the way to a high in the mid to late 80s. And then you've seen a downturn a little bit over time. Now, this only goes up to 2000, and I believe the divorce rate's pretty much stabilized in a yearly basis from those late 90s that we have there. So we have one of the highest divorce rates in the world in America, and so as a result, we have an awful lot of children who are impacted, and of course, adolescents can be just as impacted by that. So let's talk a little bit about the effects of divorce. So what we see is that those who have parents who've divorced are at a higher risk of a wide range of negative outcomes, because as we talked about earlier in the chapter, when we talked about a system, a family system, those tend to operate in their own rules. And so when you rip apart that system, it gets to be very hard to function correctly again. And you talk about a lot of transition issues. And so as a result, a lot of young people and adolescents are not able to transition successfully. And so they end up having these range of issues we'll be discussing, one of them being behavior problems, because what we see with behavior problems is that kids will lash out. They don't know maybe what's going on. They blame one parent or the other. So there's certainly an issue there. There's higher levels of psychological distress because, once again, when you maybe relied on both parents being around and caring for you, you no longer have that. As a result, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you remember that one, basically it says that you need food and safety and security before you're able to really become more self-actualized. And so as a result, usually education takes a back seat when families are having difficulties, and especially with adolescents, it's hard for them to focus, and the grades usually show. It also can be difficult for them to learn how to cope with those changes. And because they're adolescents, they have more access to things like drugs and alcohol. And what they'll find is the drugs and alcohol will help in the moment. However, it has a lot of side effects, as we all well know in our society, with the range of opioids and meth and other things going on out there. So when adolescents begin to turn to that, that leads to usually a host of other problems, even though it started because they're trying to cope with the changes that they're seeing in their family. Higher rates of initiation of sexual intercourse, usually at earlier ages. A variety of explanations for this. You could go back to issues of attachment and wanting to feel like somebody is there for you when your parents don't like each other and maybe are also having it take out on you, or you feel you're the pawn. So you can seek that out as a way of kind of getting that extra support or comfort. Misguided, but definitely can see where somebody would go with that. Not surprising, you also have some depression and withdrawal because you have all these issues, and usually anxiety is also much they all kind of intermingle here when you talk about depression and anxiety. It's what they call comorbid disorders, and they appear very consistently together. And the idea is that there's just a lot of anxiety about what's coming next. I don't know. There's probably a lot of helplessness in the feelings of adolescents whose parents are undergoing divorce or have been divorced. And so they may be depressed and feel like withdrawing. Usually you have friendships that are also negatively impacted with that. And then, of course, given all those factors, children of divorce, especially adolescents, are less likely to attend college. And we're not even getting into the family stressors that also will likely pop up, making it like financial difficulties and things like that as far as affordability with college. In emerging adulthood, the effects of parental divorce are evident, even though they may be not as striking, but some of the things that they may see crop up. And this is the effects of divorce, not necessarily if the emerging adult's parents are divorced or divorcing while they're older, but maybe it occurred in adolescence. And what we see there is a greater problem in forming close romantic relationships because, like it or not, your parents are the kind of template for what a relationship should be like in some way. And so when that relationship kind of blows up in the form of a divorce, that modeling has somehow been left behind, and it leaves a lot of questions, meaning it makes it more difficult to navigate your own relationships. And if you do get in a relationship, you become wary of marriage because you don't want to end up like your parents. And so there's a determination that if I am going to do things right, I'm going to wait and make absolutely sure that this is the right person that I'm going to be with. And if that's not the case, then I'm going to wait to get married. Now, an interesting footnote is that the risk of divorce is higher for young people from divorced families. So even though there is an increased real want to not be divorced and make all the efforts to try to avoid it, just the fact that you're coming from a divorced family makes it much more likely that you will get divorced yourself. So as far as the family process, what we see is that the outward characteristics of the family have changed. And so you either have now a single parent and they have primary custody, and then they only see the other parent inconsistently. And so it's just much more difficult to navigate, and it's a difficult one to kind of process as you go through that change. Now, the family process is the quality of the family member's relationship, how much warmth or hostility there is between them, and so on. I know when I've taught this class in the past, people have come up with examples from their own experiences where they've been put in between, where the two parents didn't even talk to each other and the children had to serve as the go-betweens. You can only imagine how difficult that would have been. And then there are others that have come to a little better terms, or at least cordial with one another, and you usually see better outcomes because of that. The factors that family process in regards to the effect, in other words, how bad can it get? Well, it can get fairly bad. The exposure to the conflict of the parents in many cases is the most damaging aspect of all this. And so it's not even the divorce itself. Sometimes the divorce can be the best thing that happens. It's all the conflict that can lead up to it, and of course the conflict that comes back afterwards, in their interactions back and forth. Obviously, this is usually ties that at least one or both have, the parents have invested a significant amount of time in, and when you rip that apart, that's going to leave a lot of bad feelings, and those can be brought out by lashing out against others, usually the ex-spouse. And so some other things that we see is just generally the exposure here is very painful, stressful, and damaging in adolescence, and that high conflict non-divorce, so it's not just the divorce itself, but high conflict non-divorce is also much more likely to create the same type of damage that I've just been talking about. So real quick, we're going to go ahead and start on Module 2 in a minute here and focus on remarriage or after the divorce.